Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're going to try to finish up today with Reconstructionism and some other thoughts that I had about it. Michael?
Yes, we were left with a bunch of people with their hands up.
I got it. I
Okay.
promise I'm going to come to that. And I did the last 2 weeks, too much talking, not enough time for discussion. So I'm going to have little bit of review because there may be some people who weren't here. Very, very brief. I'm going to read a little bit from Kaplan, a little bit from the Siddur, same documents we looked at last time. And then I promise we'll have time for question and discussion. And I got to have a hard stop today by 8:45. So that means I'm going to talk very little. Okay. But just review because I know some people have been busy having grandchildren and weren't here. Where is Kaplan doc? Oh, just hold on. I had it ready.
While you're looking for it, just as a curiosity, I grew up in a shul called Knesset Yisrael in Hollywood on Vermont.
Which is now the one, is that, oh wait, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's still called Knesset Yisrael, I think.
In Palisades.
Oh, that's a different one.
Oh, it's
anyway,
a different one. Okay.
This one was led by Kaplan's brother.
Oh, who must have been not a youngster even when you were growing up there.
No, he was, I was so tiny at that point. He seemed like a very older man, but he probably was. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Hold on. Let me get you all back. Then let me screen share.
And I have a signed copy of Kaplan's book because of that relationship.
Okay. I know there are many books called Kaplan's book. Good.
Yeah.
All right. So again, God is not a being. God is not supernatural. God is, I'm circling here with my cursor. God is the process. We'll come back to that term in when we talk about process theology. Okay. Meaning not a person. Screens around. It's nothing to do with you. Okay. And so at the bottom of page, where it says the meaning of prayer, page 115, at the bottom of the page. So what is prayer doing? Prayer aims at deriving from the process that constitutes God, the power that would strengthen the forces and relationships by which we fulfill ourselves as persons. So davening, tefillah, aims at getting something from the process that changes us, okay? Which means there is no such thing as God hearing prayer. Next level, when we address ourselves to God in a prayer of petition, we raise to the level of consciousness those desires, the fulfillment of which we regard as prerequisite to the fulfillment of our human destiny. I'm going to say that again. When we address ourselves to God in a prayer of petition, we raise to the level of consciousness those desires, the fulfillment of which we regard as prerequisite to the fulfillment of our human destiny. In other words, when we are asking God for things, petitions, bakashot, right? Bakasha, as we call it formally in the Amida, we are not speaking to a supernatural being outside of the universe who can choose to grant or not grant what we're asking for. Instead, we are raising things to our own consciousness, and those are things that help us fulfill our deepest, most profound levels of humanity, which Kaplan talks about being moral and spiritual, right? And these are the following, up until now is Kaplan's words. The following is not Kaplan's words, but kind of a third-person summary. Obviously, prayer, understood from Kaplan's perspective, can only be effective on ourselves and not on the world outside, by which he means the supernatural world. Prayer changes those who pray, giving them courage and hope that they need to achieve the goals expressed in the prayer itself, meaning I am praying for those who are sick to be healed. That means I'm expressing my deepest hope for healing, and that might change me. Maybe I'm going to go make a Bikur Cholim visit, okay? Or offer to bring someone matzah granola on Pesach, okay? But it only does something to me. It doesn't do something to out there. Now, to the extent that it gets me to act, of course, I affect the world So it's not like it's totally internal and has nothing to do with the world. But when it says not on the world outside ourselves, it means what the author means is that there's no magic that can be effected by that. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Did it just change what you see?
Yes.
Good. Okay, good. And we had the things from last week from the Reconstructionist Siddur. This is what led to a discussion with Diane, where we had changes to Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet, because Kaplan, among other things, does not believe in Jewish chosenness by God, since there is no supernatural God, right? Therefore, if everything flows from human concerns, that might mean that we, the Jewish people, have chosen to experience ourselves or dedicate ourselves to being covenanted to the process of human fulfillment, spiritual and moral fulfillment, called God, not that a being called God selected us from the outside, okay? Or, in the words of the British poetic witticism, how odd of God to choose the Jews, but not so odd, the Jews chose God. I don't know who wrote that, but I'm going to say it again. It's famous. How odd of God to choose the Jews, but not so odd, the Jews chose God. So Kaplan would say, oh, it's really about the Jews chose God, meaning we chose to commit ourselves to a particular ideal, not any supernatural force in the universe from the outside did something to us or for us. Therefore, the common version of the first blessing of the Torah, instead of Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim, who chose us from all the nations, is changed to Asher Kirvanu La'avodato V'natan Lanu Et Torato, who brought us close to your service and gave us your Torah, rather than chose us or singled us out. And similarly, Aleinu is changed. The line about Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, who chose us, and here's an alternative, Asher Natan Lanu Torat Emet, gave us true Torah, or God of the universe, as opposed to nothing about Torah. And then traditional formulation, Shelo Asanu Kigoye Aratzot, didn't make us like the other nations, in smaller font below the line. Okay, we talked about all these things last time. That was just review. Let me stop. Did I stop sharing?
No.
Okay.
No.
And we were left with a lot of questions and comments, and I'm sorry Bob isn't here. There's another Bob who was coming, who had lots to go. Who was one of the hands. Okay. And Diane raised the issue of like why it's silly to make a change in the text, because like I can change the things, the things that I choose not to believe in by interpreting them differently. So I may come to that. Okay, but first, all the hands that were up from last week. We'll start with Michael.
How do I start?
Wait, before Michael says, I want to say one more thing. I actually think, and we'll see when we're done, another couple of months, if I'm right or not. This is my prediction. I haven't planned everything what we're going to do, but my prediction is I believe that all modern Jewish theologians are either expanding on Kaplan or rejecting Kaplan. I actually believe Kaplan has kind of thrown down the gauntlet about modern Jewish theology, modern being scientifically based, a scientific view of the universe, a scientific view of anthropology and humanity, rather than a supernatural view of a being outside the universe who goes poof, okay? And Kaplan was the one who, maybe at least in America in the 20th century, articulated this most articulately and forcefully. And I think all subsequent modern Jewish theologians thinking about God are somehow expanding on him or rejecting him. So I actually think he's really, really a seminal thinker, even though Reconstructionism is the smallest of the four American denominational movements. Okay, now Michael.
Okay. As I recall from some of the excerpts you read from the Reconstructionist Siddur, it still refers to God as having created the universe. Am I correct?
Yes. Like for example, that formulation of the Aleinu. Because he stretched out the universe and the heavens, and instead of selecting us, choosing us. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, Kaplan's concept of God, as I recall, first of all, Kaplan believed in science.
Yes.
And defined God in terms of human yearnings.
Yes.
Okay. Which implies, if not proves, that to Kaplan, God doesn't exist until humans exist. There have to be humans to have these human yearnings. Therefore, how can their Siddur talk about creating the universe when we know, both scientifically and even from the words of Torah, that there was creation before there were humans? Certainly scientifically we know that.
Got it. So
it's totally inconsistent to me.
I hear you. So I'm going to try to answer that. Okay. I'm not a Reconstructionist theologian. I'm going to try to answer it. I think the nature, the universe part, creation, is about nature, right? He called it science. I think we would call it nature. I'm not distinguishing between those two things. I think those are two different ways of saying the same thing, meaning how the natural world evolves and is. Okay. I think Kaplan would say there is a creative process by which the universe unfolds. Okay. And that unfolding then leads to us, among other things. And our concept of God, part of our concept of God as humans, is appreciating, describing, understanding, and appreciating that unfolding in ways that other organisms don't, meaning presumably because of human consciousness, developing science, appreciation for nature, etc. We understand that process, which we call God, much more deeply than dogs or gorillas. They don't necessarily think about how the world unfolds and is put together. We're the ones who think about how the world is put together. You are correct, however, Michael, I think, in that Kaplan's view would say, because again, what you're saying, I'm gonna rephrase it. Okay. Rambam said, if God stopped spinning plates, the universe would not exist. Or, I'll say that differently, if God had decided not to evolve humans and had stopped with bonobos and chimpanzees, God would still exist, right? And yes, for Kaplan, God, which is the process of nature, as seen, let's say, through evolution, would still exist, but would not be grasped or appreciated the way God is grasped and appreciated because humans have consciousness. He would say, I think he would say, we're the only species who think about God. So I'm not disagreeing with you. It's a question of what does it mean God exists, right? So Kaplan would say, I think Reconstructionist would say, well, the process of nature exists, like even without humans, even without mammals, even just in a volcano, okay? And it's only humans, by elevating something to the level of our consciousness, who grasp that most fully at this moment of evolution. Michael, does that sort of respond?
Yes.
But you're correct that he says that our understanding of God, it is, and this is a critique of Kaplan by traditionalists, it is a very anthropocentric, human-centric view of God. A conception of God is something that emerges from our conscious, human strivings. Absolutely. Doesn't mean there is no process of nature without our consciousness. There was, but we're the ones who grasp that. Something like that. Larry, and then if Michael has Larry, then Paul.
This is a serious comment, even though I know you're going to laugh and think I'm not being serious. My dog thinks that I'm God.
Yes.
Actually, my dog thinks I'm a god and thinks that Diane's a god. Thinks that that my grandson is another dog.
Yeah, that is funny. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
But it does.
Yes.
But my dog has no concept of an abstract God. Has only a concept of a force in its life upon which it depends. I won't go any further than that. The human idea of God is developed into a very abstract concept of God, and I mean Kaplan is getting as abstract as as it can get. I don't think that the original concepts of God, as they've evolved over time and as they are very diverse, I think part of that concept and part of our understanding what God really means, the concept of God, is the moving from something very concrete to something much more abstract. That's my only comment.
Yes, correct. Right. Let's take it back to the J.E., the so-called J strand of the Tanakh. I believe that might have been our first class in this series 2 years ago, right? There's something called a malach, meaning God can choose to appear in human form and talk to people and say something and then disappear in the flame. And people say, oh my gosh, I just saw God. I didn't realize it. So there can't be anything more concrete than that. Or God taking the dust of the earth, forming a humanoid and breathing breath into it. There can't be anything more concrete than that. Correct. And Kaplan would say, okay, we live in the 20th century. Our understanding of the world has evolved. That is how our ancestors understood God, which is I don't mean to be mocking. I really don't mean to be mocking. Okay. But I think Kaplan would say, which is a step more sophisticated than the way your dog experiences it, but not a huge amount more sophisticated. Okay. And, we're 3,000 years later and our thinking has evolved to be, and, Rambam is surely more abstract. By the way, God is pure intelligence is pretty abstract. God is pure consciousness is pretty abstract. It's so abstract, I don't even know what it means. Okay. God is pure intelligence that exists outside of the natural universe, right? I don't even know what that sentence means, but that's what Rambam said in the 12th century. Okay. And I think Kaplan would say, okay, this is just based on our understanding of both science, which means the universe, but science also means like anthropology and history. Okay. Meaning how people, different tribes, think. Remember, a lot of the let's call it the secularization of religious thinking comes from, European 19th century colonialism. They went around the world and they saw, oh, look, there are all these different peoples, all these different tribes. Everyone thinks that their scriptures was revealed. Everyone thinks that their ritual is the center of the universe, which keeps the whole universe spinning. Every people sees themselves as the chosen people of the deity. These are just, from the I don't know what to call it, anthropological theology or theological anthropology. These are just ideas that all tribes have. So for Kaplan, by the way, that's part of science also. It's not just natural science. It's not just, biology and chemistry. It's also how humans have evolved and how we think as individuals and as groups. Okay. So for him, that's part of science also. And that's 19th century science. And he would just say, okay, our understanding of the natural world, including human beings and human tribes, okay, helps us understand God more abstractly, which he would say is correctly. It is correct to understand God more abstractly. It's incorrect to think that God could appear as a human being and then disappear in a tongue of flame up to heaven. Fair statement? I'm trying to pull a lot of things together here. Okay, 2 years worth. Okay, Paul.
Last week you referred to, I wasn't quite sure whether it was Kaplan or modern theology in general, as saying that instead of divine revelation, we're going with science, including Kaplan's expanded view of science.
Yeah.
That seems to imply there's a dichotomy there, that you can't have both, and I don't see why you can't have both.
Go ahead.
So in other words, what I'm saying is that it seems to be saying that if you're looking at things scientifically, you cannot be thinking in terms of divine revelation.
Yes.
And I don't see why that is so.
Okay. So I'm going to say two things about that. On the one hand, there are plenty of card-carrying Orthodox scientists who would agree with you about that. Okay. And on the other hand, I want to come back to it depends what you mean by science. And this is where I come back to the anthropology. Okay.
In Kaplan's expanded view of science, including anthropology.
Right. I think he would say because revelation, it depends what you mean. By the way, you'd have to get in a conversation about what does he mean by revelation, which he talks about. But he would say revelation does not come from the traditional Jewish view of revelation, is it comes from out there and it is given to us, okay? Which is not any different, he would say, I think, not any different than saying, oh, and the Muslims believe Angel Gabriel revealed the Quran to Muhammad in a cave. And every people believes that their scripture was somehow revealed. There's no nation that says, hey, we have our sacred scripture and we made it all up and it has nothing to do with what's out there. Okay? As far as I know. All right. So and by the way, Paul, we will go ahead and we will have some thinkers. You know, this class we're not focusing on revelation, right? We're talking about God as it applies to prayer, but there are certainly thinkers. I'm going to teach this at a tikkun on Shavuot at Shtibel. Maybe I'll bring this text when I organize it to this class, although it's not strictly speaking about prayer. There are thinkers who try to, I will say, square the circle, meaning they say, how do you understand revelation, Torah, as sacred and divine, okay, if you somehow accept the idea that God speaking at Sinai is no more concretely real than the angel Gabriel revealing the Quran to Muhammad in a cave. Or, of course, you could take the other view, which is that all of those accounts of revelation are true. God gave us the Torah at Sinai, literally. The angel Gabriel revealed the Quran to Muhammad in a cave. Lots of other claims, like it's possible that all those faith claims are true. The only complicating thing with that is that many of those faith claims contradict each other, right? So, you know, Muhammad is the last prophet and therefore most authoritative. We Jews would not agree with that statement, right? So the problem is that the content of those revelations conflicts with each other. Jesus says it is not important what goes into your mouth. It's only important to what comes out of your mouth. And Jews say it's important what comes out of your mouth and it's important what goes into your mouth. They're both important. They're mitzvahs bein adam lamakom and bein adam lachaviro. Mitzvot between us and God and mitzvot between us and human beings. So what comes out of your mouth is important and what goes into your mouth is important, right? So those faith claims are in contradiction with each other. Okay. So let's just say
only would seem to me only if we consider them to be literal. If we consider them to be metaphorical, then
got it. Okay.
They're not in contradiction. Okay,
but if they're metaphorical, right? But if they're metaphorical, part of the definition of metaphor, I think maybe it's not, but I'm just going to argue with you about this. Then it's not what we would call scientifically factual. Meaning, if we had a Sinai cam in the year 1250 BCE, or whatever year the experience at Sinai was supposed to have happened, as described in the Torah, if we had a Sinai or a GoPro, one of the Israelites was wearing a GoPro, camera, we would not actually see what is described in the book of Exodus, chapter 18 and 19. So I think that's what metaphor means, right? So there are thinkers, I'm not talking about the Orthodox scientists. There are Orthodox scientists who say, I believe in Sinai, and you know what I do is chemistry. One has nothing to do with each other. One has nothing to do with the other, and they're in different parts of my brain, and, God created the world, and chemistry is part of the world that God created, okay? Or there are people, the ones who square the circle, are ones who say, I try to understand the concept of revelation as divine. How do I understand it as divine? In some way that somehow accept some of the tenets of contemporary science, which would probably reject some of the literal, concrete supernaturalism, which means it's a metaphor, which means I want to say if you have a traditional view, you would criticize that by saying, but you're saying it's only a metaphor, and I'm saying it really happened concretely. And if the GoPro camera was there at Sinai, you would have heard a big voice saying, Anochi Hashem Elohecha, I am the Lord your God. Okay. As opposed to people who say, Moses, there's contemporary thinkers who say, God spoke in thunder. I've heard rabbis say this. If you read Exodus, God spoke in thunder, and Moshe heard, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And some of these theologians talk about the Sinai experience rather than the revelation at Sinai. What'd you say?
Sounds like a ride at Disneyland.
Yeah, a ride at Disneyland, the Sinai experience. Okay, pause. Any other question, comment, thoughts? It's a lot to digest. And again, as I said at the beginning, I think, or at the end of the first class, this is the third class on Reconstructionism, then we're going to drop it. I think, the vast majority of people who would identify themselves as conservative and reform and many modern Orthodox are actually Reconstructionists. They just don't understand that. Right? and that's really because, again, I think Kaplan, if I have it right, he lost the war and won the battle. Okay. Reconstructionism as a movement historically probably came along too late sociologically when the Jewish community was like saturated. Every neighborhood in Queens had 3 shuls. Why do we need a 4th shul? Okay. But he influenced, decades of conservative rabbis. Larry, is there a hand up there?
Yes. I just want to say very briefly, maybe you'll get to in a subsequent class, the theology, if I can call it that, of Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. But he's written an entire book about this subject of science versus religion, the great partnership. And if I recall correctly, he writes basically that there are 2 different spheres. Science is to explain the how, and religion is to explain the why. I may have that slightly wrong, but he addresses that an awful lot. So I think if you haven't planned on doing it, I think it'd be worth incorporating it in the future.
It would be worth doing it. I want to make a brief comment on that. I'm
listening. My
brief preliminary comment is that the how and the why, that distinction, that is an avoidance. It's an avoidance of, and this is what we're trying to talk about in this class, what is actually really the nature of God and how God acts in the world. Okay. And to say I'm separating the how and the why means God is in the realm of the why. Okay. I don't know that Rambam would be satisfied with that, okay, or the Torah, or Kaplan, meaning they are all trying to answer the question of what's factually real. I'll leave you with that. But maybe we'll include some of that. And thank you, Larry. We're going to ring off for today. No class next week. We will have class in 2 weeks, God willing, and we will move on from Kaplan to some other modern thinker. I'm not quite sure who yet. We'll work on it. By the way, I'm still deliberating about Soloveitchik and Heschel, because although they have really interesting formulations writing about God and prayer, I'm not sure that they actually say something new or different, right? So I'm looking for people. I have others who say something, I would say, new and different, but we'll see. But they were great thinkers, so I'll try to include something on them. Okay. Be Torah, stay healthy. Bye.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.